welcome. Why don't you give us a quick background on yourself in terms of your educational background, how you came to be working with Gotham Green here in the region?
Yeah, so to start off, I can talk about the company maybe first. I'll talk about myself first. Why not?
I didn't want to take your pitch and...
No. I want to also keep it conversational because I know everybody has a diverse background, so I want it to be kind of casual. So, I don't want to leave, try to cover too much and then not leave anything for Q&A afterwards. So my name's Nick. I'm originally from California. I grew up in the Bay Area, so not too far from here. I've been really focused on hydroponics and growing in general for about 8 years or 10 years now. I actually started doing it when I was in high school, kind of playing around with aquaponic systems and stuff like that back in 2008. But then I didn't really start doing it commercially, I want to say, until 2016. So I went to Chico State because I liked farming. I worked on a couple farms and ended up at Chico State, did a crop science degree, graduated in 2016. I worked for Tinnemer & Annell, which is a big Salinas-based company that does about 40,000 acres of field crop, anything from lettuce to celery, cauliflower. They like to say 1 in every 5 heads of lettuce that you buy in the store is coming from them. So think Dole, Taylor is another one of the big companies. They had a big greenhouse in Tennessee, so I moved to Tennessee, lived there for about 3 years or so. They have a 16-acre greenhouse there, and they've just focused on butterhead lettuce in a deep water culture system, also hydroponic. I got a lot of great experience there, a lot of R&D trials, and also grew in some of our new greenhouses that they had. So they had kind of a, I wouldn't say older style, but they had a polyethylene hoop house style greenhouse. And then that was about 12 acres, and then they built a new Venlo style greenhouse next to it. So it's interesting to see the difference between growing under glass and then also growing under plastic. So we were able to see that, we were able to see yield differences, and then I think since then, so good friends with some of the people there, they now expanded that out. So now half and half of the facility is half glass and half under plastic. So interesting stuff with that. After 3 years, then I moved in with Gotham. Been at Gotham for 5 years. The experience at Gotham has been interesting. When I first started the company, and you'll see some more of this with the slides later on, I started with the company 5 years ago in Baltimore, Maryland, when the greenhouse was just up and coming. So it was our 6th greenhouse in the company, and it was a 2-acre facility, just like this one here in Davis. I got there when we were still under construction, got the whole place up and running. Once we got it up and running for about 2 years, then they transferred me back to California, which was fun. Right back into a construction zone, so you might have seen it, but I want to say in summer 2020 is when we started to get things going, and then by the end of 2021 is when we started to really start harvesting products. So same kind of thing, from startup, from construction up until this. And so yeah, been with the company for 5 years. We started with 6 greenhouses, or when I started, now we're at 13 greenhouses. So it's been interesting just to see the company scale. All of my experience has been in the growing department, so I can't really speak too much on the marketing, business, and strategy and some of those things, but I'll try to answer as much as I can. So yeah, that's the background. And then a little bit about Gotham Greens. Well, this is a good overview. This is our kind of statement, right? We're an indoor farming company, fresh food company on a mission to transform the way we approach our food system, putting people and the planet at the forefront. To John's point, so we started off, we were the first commercial scale greenhouse in New York City. The idea that the founders had was anything in New York you're getting is coming from California mostly, Arizona, sometimes a little bit from Florida, and then I think nationwide they say about 40% of our produce comes from Mexico. So basically anything that you're eating in New York, where the main population center is, that whole Northeast region, is at least 7 days old. So the founders, all 3 of them lived in New York. The idea was, can we produce something locally and then be able to supply that to the grocery store chains? That was the value proposition. And it was really effective. I was actually in New York, my sister lives there, so I was there last week, and everybody knows Gotham Greens. We have a really good brand recognition in that area. We built 3 greenhouses on rooftops in New York. Then we built a rooftop greenhouse in Chicago, and then everything else since then has been on the ground. So you can think of this as the products that we do. These are our kind of product suites, I guess you could call it. So we do lettuce and basil, that's our big ones. So we started off with lettuce and basil. We then moved into value-added products. So we took the basil, one of the VP of operations, grandma had a recipe for pesto. We commercialized it, and then we started making pesto from our seconds from the basil plant. So you can kind of think of this is like the top part of the plant. If you ever grow basil at home, you'll see kind of at each internode, you'll see that at each node of the plant, you'll see something that's resembling something you buy at the store, right? So maybe the top 3 nodes is something that you'd actually buy in a package like this, and then there's some plants, bottom parts of the plants that stick out, and so some of that stuff ends up getting composted. We started taking that stuff, and then also based off of retail sales, so any extra basil was then sent to get made into pesto. So pesto really took off. I think the company really saw that as like a light, and was like, this is a great thing. So from pesto, we moved into vegan pesto. We made salad dressing, so this is our whole suite of salad dressings. We then started moving into the dips, so that was something we started, I want to say 2 years ago. And then now in the last year, we really have ramped up our salad kit offerings. So I think salad kits really started taking off across the whole industry maybe a couple years ago. We started getting in on that as well. We now have it's listed here, but it's a Southwest style salad kit. We do this Green Goddess salad kit, which is kind of like pumpkin seeds, cranberries, stuff like that. And then we do a Caesar. So we have the salad kits, the dips now, salad dressings, and the pestos. So it's really kind of taken off. I think the company's strategy originally was lettuce and basil, and now we've grown quite a bit. Okay, so just talking about expansion, this is a good visual because I think it really shows what I was talking about, because these were our first 3 greenhouses. It looks like 12, there's actually 13 greenhouses. So this is Chicago 1, and then this is our second Chicago greenhouse. So first 3 greenhouses, you can see the square footage of the greenhouses, they're a little bit smaller. If you were to add up all 3 of those greenhouses, they roughly equate to the square footage of Davis location, which is 2.2 acres, 1 hectare, roughly 100,000 square feet. And yeah, you can really see the evolution. So each new greenhouse, we try to adopt new technology. Part of that also, I want to caveat, is based off of climate. So first 3 greenhouses were kind of typical Quonset houses. They had a pattern fan system, so very typical greenhouse style, where you have a pad wall on one side, you have an exhaust fan on the other side, pulls that cool air across the greenhouse. It does create a gradient effect, so there are improvements to that system, but it's very effective. So that was our first 3 greenhouses. I think we kind of realized that although it is very cool, I think from like a marketing sense, and like it's very cool that we're able to utilize that space on top of rooftops in New York, logistically it can be kind of a nightmare to grow on a rooftop. Literally they'll bring cases down elevator chutes on at this Whole Foods, which I've been to, and deliver to the stores, and there's a lot of nuance with that, a lot of challenges. Trying to do maintenance on the rooftop of a rooftop is quite challenging. So all the greenhouses that were built after that, this was our second big expansion. So this is Baltimore, where I was working, Providence, Baltimore, and Denver as well, but Chai 2 were all built in kind of the 2018, 2019 years. And the big difference with that is we started moving to the Van Loo style, Dutch style greenhouse, which you see in Davis. So the main advantages to that system, we started doing semi-closed greenhouses. So they're not that much different than the exhaust fan, but what you can think of is instead of pulling air across the greenhouse, where you're pulling that cold air from, say, like this western side, from the east to the west, for example, we're now pushing the air inside the greenhouse, creating a positive pressure. So where that pad wall is, we then have fans set up where we're taking that air. It goes through kind of a treatment, air treatment room, you could call it, where we get the temperature and hopefully the humidity of the air we want. We then push it underneath the growing lines to try to get that nice equilibrium across the whole greenhouse and take out some of the gradient that you might see with a typical pattern fan system. The other benefit with that is, you actually can't really tell, If you drive by the greenhouse in Davis, you'll see a kind of net on the back. That's a thrip screen and aphid screen. So by doing that, you're pushing air into the greenhouse, so we can screen out everything that's coming in, which is really nice. I would say we don't have aphids or thrips ever, but it does a much better job of screening things out. So all the air that enters the greenhouse is much more controlled. So that's the technology, and that's the evolution of the company. The other thing is the kind of reality of working with these lower latitudes. So even just the difference between going from Baltimore and moving to Davis has been a completely different change in terms of what's able to be yielded out of the greenhouses and the capability of the greenhouses. Because the East Coast is very hot, it's very humid in the summertime. Lettuce does not like to be hot. In general, it doesn't like average daily temperatures really over, I'd say, 25 degrees Celsius. So in Davis, we're able to get around that because it is so much drier. We're able to humidify the air, cool the air, and then at night it's great because it cools down. So we're able to manage those average daily temperatures. The reason why that's really important is because if you think about light mixed with temperature, that's really our bread and butter for steering the crop. And if you can control average daily temperatures, then you can understand your yield curve throughout the year. The challenge with the East Coast greenhouses oftentimes is just in the summertime you lose yield actually, just because even though you get enough light, you're dealing with too high of temperatures. So the newest greenhouses that we have are down in here. So we have this Dallas County, Texas, and Monroe, Georgia greenhouse. Those are our newest greenhouses down here. They're also very big. They're also pretty expensive. But those utilize mechanical cooling. So literally a type of air conditioning is used for that. And we're able to get around that yield curve that I just talked about. So I think one of the challenges from a business standpoint for the company is you have 13 different greenhouses. So there's a kind of embedded resilience to the system. We try to be as local as possible, but for example, if you have an issue in New York and something happens, right? Anything, you have an aphid infestation one week, just for example. If Providence is still having good yields and Baltimore is having good yields, we can kind of mitigate some of those challenges by having all of these different greenhouses. I think the downside for that system is then you're kind of spread out. So resources are a little bit more spread out. For our production planning and working with sales, there's a lot more variability at each greenhouse, right? You have different, every grower is different. Every operations team is different, so there's capabilities within each greenhouse that might be different too. So this is our overall network. It's been a very interesting ride. We've gone through a series of different funding. I started with the company, we had gotten some Series C funding, then we got Series D funding, and then I think 2 years ago we got like $400 million or something in the Series E funding. So the company's seen a lot of growth. And you can kind of see that with this Western movement. And yeah, in terms of each greenhouse, we try to stay locally. So most of the product coming out of Davis is going to Northern California. Most of it's going to Sacramento, Bay Area. We do sometimes ship down to LA. We don't really like to because the quality kind of goes out, so there's some shipping issues with that. And really, if anything, we're only shipping down to LA because we might someday build a greenhouse here. Same thing with Pacific Northwest. In reality, most of the production is going in here, right? So we're kind of hitting these areas. Most of the stuff in Chicago is just hitting the Midwest. We don't have greenhouses in the Pacific Northwest and the Southwest, but that could definitely change. I think for the company, can't speak for what Raj wants to do, for example, but I think it's dependent on the market, it depends on interest rates, depends on a lot of things, depending on what we want to do. Having lived through, it is one company, each new greenhouse, I will say, feels like a startup. Because even though it's like, we're a nationwide company, every time we've built a greenhouse, there is, you have to learn what the greenhouse is capable of from a climate standpoint. You have to figure out the operations team, the labor, and it can take sometimes over a year to figure all those things out. So as much as we would like to hit the ground running and be able to sell and sell out immediately, it's really challenging. You also have the issue to the point about, the strategy on the East Coast has been always, this is fresh, this is local, this is better than anything coming from California. The difference on the West Coast is everything's coming from California. So the value proposition here has been more about like, you know, we're trying to save water. We're more sustainable, we're pesticide free, and there's an element of higher quality because it's grown in the greenhouse. So it's maybe a bit of a tougher sell, but it is something that we're definitely pushing with our West Coast greenhouses. And I will say, I mean, we're basically sold out now, so it's taken a little bit, but I think that's one of the benefits of the company I've seen is I've seen some of our competitors will build, you know, these are pretty small greenhouses, and yeah, there's an argument that the overhead's definitely higher operating cost. You know, like I could pay one person like me one salary to run a 200,000 square foot greenhouse versus a 100,000 square foot greenhouse. So, you know, you still have that same cost level, but you then build in the resiliency of being able to put in a new greenhouse. You know, instead of investing $300 million into a vertical farming outfit in a big location where you don't have sales yet, you can, you know, get in with a smaller greenhouse, see how things go. Now we're looking at California and some of these other locations about putting in expansion. So for example, in Davis, we have 30 acres. Greenhouse is only sitting on 2.2 acres. So California is a hard place to run a business, I will say, just in terms of energy costs and certain, you know, construction costs. Everything just kind of costs more here. But it's an amazing place to grow, I will say. I think that the yields, Baltimore's done an amazing job, but the yields coming out of California have been really good just because you get a lot of sunlight. You have, you know, 4 months of sun in the summertime. You know, you don't have to spend any money on electricity to run those lights or anything. Whereas on the East Coast, you have thunderstorms, you have a lot more variability. So, okay, digging in. This is just kind of more of a visual. These are some photos I've taken of what you would see if you were to come into the greenhouse. This, based on the look of it, it's probably like 21 days old. Same thing as the lettuce. This is a look straight down the line. So this is, when I was talking about semi-closed greenhouses, that black strip right there, that is the pad wall. So that's where that air, that dry air from outside is coming in, getting humidified. It's this little glass box right there. That air goes in, it goes underneath the ground where the walkway is, and then it comes underneath all of the crop and gets pushed in. So all that cooler air is getting pushed underneath the crop through a perforated tube and then comes up in a nice balanced way underneath the crop. Then this is the greenhouse, so this is kind of what I was saying. So this all is part of Gotham. This is our current setup right now. If you see, we just put in a huge solar array here, so if you're driving by the freeway, you'll see that, which is really exciting because I think based on the kilowatt hours that it can put out, it can basically get us all of our energy needs. So that's been a huge win for us. Just some more stuff about the company. You know, we're trying to be local, farm closer to home, pesticide free, clean hydroponic. I will say, you know, we're pesticide free. What that means is we have no pesticide residue at harvest. Like, we don't use any chemical pesticides that you would find at harvest. We do use like OMRI, like organic sprays, things like soaps and bacteria and things that are relatively benign, but pesticide free at harvest. We're certified B Corp in Patagonia, Ben & Jerry's, these kinds of companies. So we're trying to look at our water usage and our land usage. And yeah, so that's what the greenhouse looks like. This also, just so you know, this is the nursery. This looks like my greenhouse for sure. The other slides, these were my photos, but these are for marketing, but it looks like our greenhouse. This is the nursery section, which I'll talk about in this one. So I'll give you a quick overview of the overall operations. So you walk in the greenhouse, this is what you're gonna see. Everything starts here. So we were kind of talking earlier about tray expansion and what that looks like. We start with the trays. These are peat moss trays. They come dehydrated. We hydrate them with hot water. They then go into a seeding machine. They get seeded. It then spends about 2 weeks in the nursery. So that's what you're seeing here from the cotyledon stage. And then you can see kind of this progression over time from day 7 to day 14. So that's kind of what you're seeing here. So Gotham, just so you know, we're like we seed every day. So it's kind of like a factory, basically, a plant factory. So we're seeding, transplanting, and harvesting every day of the week, except for Christmas, basically. And we kind of work our schedule around that, but we are producing year round. At day 14 or Depends on the time of year. Right now, we're at 15 to 17 days at transplant. We're transplanting here. So all of these trays, these are getting ready to be transplanted. They get transplanted right here. Those go into our NFT gutter system, and they go out onto the lines. What you don't really see here is those gutters get moved, and there's a very simple system to move the gutters through the greenhouse. It uses a hydraulic pump and piston to move those and oscillate them through the greenhouse. It then spends most of its time in this production zone. Well, I think total it's about 23 to 25 days in this zone right now. That's a total right now, at least in my greenhouse, of 40 days. Most of our greenhouse sites are 35 to 40 days. So depends on which greenhouse you're in, and depends on what the targets are for customers and also the growers, right? So my job is to produce as much yield as I can based off of the targets I'm trying to hit, so that we can satisfy what the customer ordered for long range projections as well as short range projections on a weekly basis. So 23 to 25 days. It can go down to 21, but right now it's 23 to 25 days is what it looks like. So really, most of this growth is pretty exponential. So this is about 14 days old. This might weigh 2 grams. At 21 days, it might weigh 10 to 15 grams, and then day 38, it might weigh anywhere from 150 to 180 grams. So it really spikes up at the end. And then that's what we're harvesting right there. That's our butterhead lettuce. So, and then I'll just kind of briefly talk about the operations post-harvest. We go to harvest it, it goes on a conveyor. They're taking the stems out, they're putting it on a conveyor, it's coming down, they're trying to QC and catch anything that's coming through. That is then going into, that product then is ready to be packed, right? So then that goes onto a conveyor system. All of those people over there, they're weighing out the lettuce, they're getting that 4.5 ounce clamshell, and then they're putting it onto another conveyor, goes through our sealer, so she's just putting a little promotion sticker on it, goes through a metal detector, and then it gets palletized, boxed, and put into the cooler. Once it's in the cooler, might spend 1 to 2 days, gets shipped out, and then it goes to either DCs or retail stores, depending on what our contract is with whatever company we're working with. So that's the operation. And then this is the greenhouse design. I talked about this a little bit, and very briefly mentioned that this is what one of the dashboards looks like, right? So when I was mentioning like heating or cooling rather, what I meant was the air's coming over here, it's going into this air mixing unit, it's then coming up into this fan and then being distributed underneath this tube. So you can see like 23.8 degrees, 24.1 degrees, so all of that air is coming up into the greenhouse, and then based off of pressure will be released outside of the top of the vents. So, and then when we're heating, just so you know, this guillotine vent closes up, and then we're just circulating that air throughout the greenhouse. We have a boiler system that boils water, keeps hot water through the tubes, and acts as our heating bank right in here. So this is our greenhouse. We use diffused glass, and then we have 2 curtains. So the diffused glass is great. That's something that we've really adopted. It does cost more money, but the diffused glass is great. Allows different spectrums to come in. So between classic and glass, there's a differing amount of like spectrums that we see. We see a little bit more UV with the glass. The diffused glass helps to penetrate the canopy a little bit deeper. Some of the research they've done at Wageningen in the Netherlands has shown that, where they've really seen some benefits using diffused glass versus just clear glass. So we have diffused glass. A lot of our greenhouses now are all glass. Also lets in a little bit more UV, a little bit more blue, so any of the reds that we're growing will express their pigment or anthocyanin content a little bit more. And then we have 2 curtains. So we have a shade curtain and an energy curtain. So you can think of them up in the roof truss. One is for shade, so that blocks half the light coming in. The other one's for energy. It blocks less light, but it traps more of the heat in. So it's kind of like 2 blankets. So every night I close those up. Depending on humidity, I might leave a gap, but those basically close up at night and retain the temperature in the greenhouse. Kind of acts like a blanket or like a double pane glass window that you might have at home. And then just a brief note on hydroponics. We use a nutrient film technique, NFT. I know a lot of our competitors do deep water culture, just different systems. I used to work in a greenhouse. I was deep water culture, which is very similar, but just a little bit different. Nutrient film technique, if you're not familiar with it, we irrigate from one side, it's on a pitch, so all of that nutrient-rich water goes from one side to the other side. All of that water has all 17 elements. It's kind of like, you can think of a modified Hoagland solution if you're familiar with that. So it has basically all the nutrients that it needs. It is recirculating though, so managing fertility is something that we're constantly monitoring and keeping an eye on. And then we're managing the pH as well as the water temperature, and all those things are really important. And this is, when we're talking about using water savings, this is what we mean, because all the water that we use, we can just, goes to the other side, goes in a collection gutter, goes back to the irrigation room, goes through a paper filter, filters out, goes right back out. So we're able to use and save a good amount of water by doing that. Okay, and then where does it go? So this is an example of where most of our product goes. This is all of our nationwide partners, I'd say. The one missing from here locally is Nugget, so we sell a good amount of product to Nugget locally. Kroger's a big win for the company. Kroger's huge, so being able to sell to Kroger and Ralph's and Rayleigh's and those kinds of stores has been big for us. Whole Foods was one of our original partners. So in New York, we really had a good establishment with Whole Foods, and I think we're considered their hydroponic label. So we sell a lot to Whole Foods, increasing amounts of Kroger, and then we recently started selling to Costco on the East Coast, which has been good, but also challenging. Okay, and that's a photo of the romaine. So figured I'd give a good spiel of most of what you would hopefully ask, and then I'll just leave it up to open the questions for everybody. So. Yeah?
Why Davis?
So a couple of reasons. I think, from what I've heard, it's the proximity of the university is one, which I think has actually been really helpful because we have gotten a couple employees hired from the university. We don't do any official research with the university, but the land itself was actually, I think, originally university owned. I think actually Harvey Olmo, I want to say is his name, one of the original, the guys at the enology program, it was his property. So that whole area is previously UC Davis land. Northern California, I think, is a really good place to be. We're right on the I-80, which has been really helpful for all of our shipping. We have deliveries coming in and out all the time. Being right by the freeway is amazing. Northern California also gets an immense amount of sun. They had looked at being closer to the Bay Area on the coast, where historically there was a lot of floriculture and stuff like that. Land price, I think, on the coast is a little bit higher, as well as they were a little bit nervous about the light levels being lower. So I think the only big detriment to being up here is just the summertime. It's very hot. So we're able to cool the greenhouse effectively with the pattern fan, but then we're using water to evaporate to cool off the greenhouse. So it's not all perfect, but it's been a really good location, I think, for the company. Yeah.
Just curious, why the Virginia facility is 540,000 square feet? It's much larger than all the other ones.
Yeah, sorry, I actually forgot to mention Virginia.
I kind of assume maybe that it's a hub for a number of cities in 2 or 3 adjoining states. So, because I don't think the DC market would absorb. I lived in DC not that long ago for 3 years, so I've got some local knowledge.
Yeah, I think the DC market is unique because you have a couple big cities. You've got Richmond, Virginia, as you're kind of going down the way. But it's unique because it's kind of rural. There's not a lot of huge cities further south. So Stevensburg, Virginia was unique. This was actually an acquisition, and this is our biggest greenhouse. So this is a big deal because it was actually made by the company that was building some of our other greenhouses. So one of the manufacturers that we used to build this greenhouse, they had this greenhouse, and it was kind of something that, basically it was something where they had a project going with another company. It fell through financially, and then they were the construction company, but they ended up having this greenhouse. So So they operated it, but it wasn't super successful, so they ended up selling it to us.
Yeah.
So, and that's the greenhouse that we're producing a lot for like Costco from, because it's so large. The kind of benefit is most of the systems are the same, so they have the same like NFT system that we have at the other sites, so there's some complementing technologies, but that's the main reason. It was, I think, one of those things where I don't think that they were 100% sold on having that business, and then we bought it from them.
And I know from other sources that there were lots of large warehouse facilities that were available in North Carolina and probably into Virginia that you could pick up for, you know, very attractive prices, so there may have been some, you know, connection with that.
Yeah. I don't know all of the details. I know that like in the news now, you know, a lot of the vertical farming companies are going out of business. A lot of our competitors have really struggled, I think, in the past few years. I think money was cheap a few years ago. It's no longer cheap. So, you know, you saw this proliferation of all these people doing vertical farming and stuff. And I have nothing against vertical farming. It's just a different kind of technology. I think obviously we're still here. I think one of the things that's led to our current success, at least, is kind of having a focus, but also we're using technology that's already proven in the Netherlands. I mean, this is, you know, hydroponic Venn-style growing is ubiquitous in Europe and Northern Europe. So I don't think that the company's business strategy was that foreign of a concept. I think one of the problems I've seen with the vertical farming is that it's a very, I mean, this is CapEx heavy too, but you have to replicate the sun. So your OpEx cost can be higher with that. Granted, it is a smaller like footprint, but you do have to spend more money on electricity to replicate what you're not getting from the sun for free. So we do spend more money maybe heating and cooling the whole greenhouse, 100,000 square feet, but then we're not paying for the sun. Most, you know.
Right. So you don't have to use a lot of overhead lamps and all that.
We do. I mean, you can see like right now if you drove by the greenhouse, I have it running until 10 tonight. So it's lit up. But it's usually, at least for us, we run from October till May with lights, supplementing what we're getting from the sun. So yeah, we do have to use supplemental lighting because we're, you know, using the sun. So it's trying to find that balance between buying the right amount of light. Supplemental light, I think, is big. For us, we can get away with a certain amount. It also depends on what you're trying to do. At least for us, we're just trying to supplement what we're getting in the winter. If we had no lights, it would really hurt us because our yield curve would be like this. We still see somewhat of a curve into the winter, but we're able to kind of mitigate that with the lights.
Yeah.
I want to say probably get about 25% less light at least in the wintertime, sometimes more than that.
Because you're up in Brooklyn and Chicago and Rhode Island, you're in the snow belt.
Oh, it's brutal. Yeah, let's say in the Northeast, especially in the wintertime, they get a lot less light. So we've kind of worked it out where they've done a really good job, I think, managing the greenhouses. Surprisingly though, actually California in the wintertime, I've compared some data. It's like they actually get similar light levels to us because we get all of our rain in like 2 months. So like in January, February, it's really dark. So the difference between like a snowstorm in Baltimore versus a rainstorm in Davis, like at least for the plants, is kind of similar. I mean, they have to use a lot more natural gas to burn. You have to melt the snow off the roof. But similar light levels.
But I've heard in the snow belt with a lot of vertical farming that when it gets too cold, you just don't produce because the energy costs are prohibitive. Is that true?
Some people do.
Yeah.
I know, like I heard, especially with the war in Ukraine, a lot of the greenhouses in Europe just didn't produce because it's so expensive for gas and it's so much colder there. We didn't do that. It's also a lot cheaper on the East Coast compared to here. We're kind of off grid. We're not tied in the city, so we have to pay for propane to heat. Granted, it is warmer or more temperate versus there. It's a little bit cheaper for natural gas and electricity. So we produce through the winter. You know, we're not going to be like maybe as profitable in the wintertime versus spring and fall, but we produce year round. So, yeah.
How do you keep all your water lines biofilm and pathogen free given everything in the water?
I know, it's a challenge. Personally, I mean, some of the new greenhouses have like ozone. I don't. I like to use hydrogen peroxide. I do a daily dose of hydrogen peroxide. That's how I get around it, which is actually pretty effective.
You don't see any resistance to it building up?
I mean, we have bioslime, but we're able to still make it work. I mean, I'm really curious, like, I know like there's a lot of research done with the nanobubble technology and using some of these other things. I haven't experimented much with it. I've tried it in deep water culture, didn't work for us, I think because of the volume of water. I think most of us have just gotten into the habit of using hydrogen peroxide, which is pretty cheap. I've experimented with chlorine-based things like ECA machines. I don't love chlorine. Lettuce is very sensitive to chlorine, and so I don't like to use it at all. Hydrogen peroxide you can also burn the plants, but they're a little more tolerant of it. So.
Do you have like an homophobic coating on the lines or anything? Or
No, it's just normal PVC.
Oh.
So, I know a lot of people talk about bioslime. We've been lucky, maybe. I mean, the preventative treatments help. We definitely have issues with Pythium, but we treat for it. It's not the best treatment. I think ozone would be better from the start, so you can maybe prevent some of the biofilm, but yeah. Yeah.
Looking at the cost of production, on one end of the scale is going to be vertical, which has got lots of robotics, and there have been massive venture investments to support that, and some high-profile failures in that domain. You're kind of in the middle, and then there's the Salinas-Yuma oscillation going back and forth. What kind of metrics do you use for cost of production, and is there parity between what's going on in Salinas and Yuma and what you're doing?
Well, I will say our metrics are very similar to any other KPI or P&L sheet, sorry, and looking at EBITDA, right, for how we're doing as a per site and for the company. Our metrics, I mean, my metrics and KPIs are really focused on yield and resource utilization. So how much am I spending and how much am I making for the company? So that's how I track my performance or our performance as a team. And then we have sales metrics, but I would say that's, to keep it like bare bones, that's kind of what we look at. In terms of like the Salinas and Yuma thing, I think I worked at TNA, and it was interesting to see because we had that 16-acre facility along with the field-grown products. It actually, I think, was almost harmonious because when we had issues with field-grown, we could supplement, and vice versa. Like, if our retail, if like Walmart was okay with it, if we were low on hydroponic production, we could send field-grown. So there's an element of resilience there. I'm really curious because I haven't seen a lot of big growers in Salinas switch to hydroponic or like invest in it really, except for TNA. I want to say like Taylor maybe has investments in it, but not that much. Or they're not actually actively owning any companies producing it. But with the like floods that they had in Salinas and the E. coli outbreaks, I think they're going to look at this more over time, especially. But I mean, that's just my personal opinion. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, I'm walking away thinking having indoor and outdoor grow gives you some flexibility, and that's good. And I didn't hear you say there's huge cost differences in producing in indoor versus outdoor.
Oh, yeah. This is definitely more expensive, for sure. And I've heard through the grapevine from some people like Taylor that that's something they've said before, where it's field grown. The profits are streamlined and you can make money. Whereas like this, you have to differentiate yourself from competition. I think we're still in, the industry seems to be consolidating. It seems like there's less and less players. But it's also in the realm now where people, I think, are starting to try to price cut and compete with each other. So we have competitors trying to sell their product for less, even if it means that they're not making money off of it. So the cost of production is higher, CapEx much higher. I think the benefit though is, once you have the system up and running, you can run these systems, like, especially with the glass greenhouse, there's not a lot of, there is some depreciating value to it, but the structure itself doesn't depreciate. I mean, it's just glass and steel. So the actual stuff that we use on a day-to-day basis doesn't depreciate a ton. And I think the system, once it's up and running, can run pretty well. Like the one that I worked at in TNA was open in 2008. They're still running pretty strong, and I've heard pretty good things from them. But it is more expensive, and I don't know if and there's also, I will say, there's a steep learning curve between hydroponic growing and field growing. And I saw that a lot too, where there's this kind of disconnect where even from the sales down, or sales, marketing, and in general, they're expecting the product to look a certain way. They're expecting to see like romaine hearts, and we can't produce that in the greenhouse. So you have a completely different temperature and light level combination in the greenhouse, where it's typically warmer and typically less light, versus in Salinas, like, you're getting maybe 50 moles outside, and in Davis, you might be getting 15. So the light difference is completely different, and the genetics aren't there quite yet, I think, to replicate, nor should I don't think that we should try to replicate what they're doing in the field. So there's a bit of a disconnect, I think, between even what field-grown customers or sales are trying to do versus what we can actually do in the greenhouse. I think it'll probably grow, but I know that in California there's some challenges with regulation in terms of building new greenhouses. I think that was maybe to combat some of the cannabis industry, but it's not that easy to put a greenhouse in California, to my knowledge. At least when I was working with the engineering team for our company, they were saying that they were putting regulations to put in like double pane glass and stuff like that would make it basically impossible to put in a greenhouse in California. But yeah, I don't know the update on that. It's something I've heard. Yeah.
You touched upon it, the genetics part of it.
Yeah.
So, and you said that you don't have an
No.
company. So how do you select your seeds?
We do trials. So we take conventional varieties that they're working on, and we trial them in the greenhouse and see how they perform. I think maybe 8-10 years ago, there was much less available. I know that, like, as I was working with some seed producers, a lot of times they would just give you stuff that was the minis, like the smaller varieties in field grow, which don't necessarily work inside of the greenhouse. Now, I will say, Nunhems or BASF, and Rick Schwann and NZM, they're investing a lot into this space because they see it growing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot more available. There's a lot more focus on that, where they're doing variety trials. They're doing variety trials in greenhouses, so they're seeing what's performing inside the greenhouse. So there's a lot more available now. But I've seen what the greenhouse can produce. I think we're nowhere close to the ceiling. I think from what I've seen, I can see different varieties perform under much harsher conditions and yield much more, depending on the genetics. So I know that we haven't hit the yield ceiling in the greenhouse yet. I think field grown, I think you're already yielding so much in field grown that it's hard to squeeze out that extra yield, and I don't think we're close to that in the greenhouse. I think we're decades behind because they don't have the varieties yet. That's just from my maybe subjective experience. But
One of the reasons I asked you that is any of the trade development teams which are offering the big companies, one of the factors they look at is the cheap ID by EV traction, right? Your environment is electric, which changes by geography, and hopefully at some point you'll introduce LED lights as well as to reduce your cost of collection. But that's how many of the genetics are work. And maybe that's what I was thinking. When you don't have an R&D, somebody else is doing that. You're taking recipes and trying at different geographies to find which is the best that grows under the so-called circumstances or conditions.
yeah, Yeah, that's a good point, because obviously we have all these different greenhouses, they do perform differently in different scenarios. I think I kind of mentioned the heat that you experience on the East Coast due to the more humid conditions. You're not able to evaporate moisture to the point where you can get the temperature down. The temperatures that they're seeing are much different than at the other greenhouses. So being able to try out certain varieties, and what we normally do is, like, if we have successful varieties, we have to ensure that they'll work at every greenhouse. And that's usually our process. So even if we might trial it at one place, we'll make sure that it works everywhere before we kind of launch it as an official variety for us. Yeah.
Following up on that, and you don't have to go into specifics, but you talked earlier about the weather and the different regions, and each greenhouse has its own production. Do you have nationalized pricing for your product lines, or is it regional depending on the season? Like, how do you control that? You said, profits go down in the wintertime usually. Do you have a year-long similar price, or do you fluctuate?
It's mostly the same year-round.
Okay.
They do promotions though, right? Like, if we just got Kroger, they might do some promotions, do some, like, buy one, get one free type things to get our sales up. So I think it's more sales dependent.
Okay.
If sales are low, they're gonna do promos. We try to keep the prices consistent though. I think that's one of the things I heard from sales recently. It's like, it's tricky if our competitors are trying to price cut and they have maybe financial backers that don't care if they lose money, if they can gain market share, which kind of hurts the whole industry. But I think we're seeing that more because it's becoming more competitive. So now it's like there's Gotham Greens, there's Little Leaf, there's Revel, I know, and Bright Farm. So there's a few of the big kind of like greenhouse companies within our range that are competing for that space.
Is there any also looking at growing it out other than the rooftop and the big city? There's like 30,000 to 200,000 to 5. Any sweet spot on the side?
Oh, on the size. I think we're starting to put in bigger greenhouses, but kind of like I mentioned earlier, it does amplify the risk. So, we put this big greenhouse in Texas, for example. It just doubles your capacity and doubles your kind of OpEx and everything. So it's like, okay, now there's even more pressure to get the sales up because you have this bigger greenhouse. So like, yeah, I wouldn't say it's a gamble, but it is different. So you build this bigger greenhouse. I think based off of previous experiences, the company wanted to put in bigger greenhouses because they've seen, hey, if we put in 100,000 square foot greenhouse, it gets sold out within year 1 or 2. So it's like, let's just double it. And based on what we're projecting, we should hit that target. But it adds to the risk. And I think I've seen pros and cons. Like when I worked at TNA, for example, you have a 16-acre facility, you can produce a ton of cases in one place, and you can ship to I know that we were shipping from Tennessee to Florida, all the way from Florida all the way up to sometimes the Northeast. So that like that whole entire region, using an entire 3PL truck to ship our product. So there's some scale, your scaling is more beneficial that way, but then you can't pivot as easily. So I think we've done pretty well with that, but I think we've kind of hit this sweet spot in this kind of 150, 200,000 square foot range. I don't know if that's going to change. I think it's completely dependent and driven by sales though. Like I think, we might put in a greenhouse in Seattle or something, right? And then, depending on sales, I think what I've seen at least is we buy enough land so we can expand. And I actually think it's been really helpful for us because there's a lot of growing pains at the beginning, learning the equipment too. Another thing I didn't mention is just the automation, because that's sometimes something that's brought up quite a bit. Everything's about automation and AI. And we don't have a ton of that automation in Davis, but our newer greenhouses do. So we have automatic transplanters at some of our new greenhouses, cut down on labor there. Now instead of the gutters being harvested on out in the greenhouse, our new greenhouses have the gutters coming into one centralized harvesting location. So we're seeing more of that automation. The increase in automation though too, you have to have the right people who know how to work those systems. You can rely on your vendors to some degree, but you have to have plant managers, you have to have people who, maybe not engineers always, but you have to have technical people who can troubleshoot those things. Because yeah, you might, and we've seen that even in Davis, you try to automate something and spend a lot of money, you end up being able to do it cheaper with really efficient labor. But obviously the workforce in California is dwindling. We're seeing less farm workers coming up, I think. So the availability in the workforce is an aging workforce. From what I've seen too, I mean, a lot of our core employees are starting, they're on the older side, and they maybe have worked doing field growing. You know, one of our best harvesters, for example, was a Salinas harvester for years, and then I think came up here, and I think it was kind of serendipitous, but she works at the greenhouse. She's our best harvester. So there's some of those intangible things. I think, yeah, in 5 or 10 years, everything's going to be a lot more automated, at least some of our packing and our transplanting stuff. Yeah.
I think you mentioned you do variety trials within the greenhouse. Are you also experimenting with light levels in terms of more hours of sunlight? Does that cut down the number of days you need to be out in the greenhouse? And is there a break even for that? And also, you mentioned there's 17 different elements you need to have in the nutrient mix. Are you experimenting continuously with varying levels to see, does this give us more yield or less yield, or is there a standard recipe and we just do it this way, everywhere?
Yeah, so for the variety trials, or not the variety trials, but the plant density to light level kind of ratio is something that's kind of in our wheelhouse as growers, not so much R&D, because that's kind of what our bread and butter is how do you best utilize every square foot in the facility. And that's kind of what I meant by the days online are like 23 versus 25 days in the greenhouse. Anytime you increase the length of time in the greenhouse, you'll increase yield per plant, but then you have to decrease the size of the groups that you're putting through the greenhouse. So there's this constant kind of balance between time and space. So usually what we do is we increase time as we go into winter so that we can hit our targets, and then we decrease our group sizes. I think the challenge and some of the nuance to that is it's light dependent and it's also customer dependent. So you might have some customers that really want, for example, if you go to the store, I would have brought lettuce, but then I'd have to carry more boxes. So I brought basil because it's easier. But we sell like baby bowls, which is just the full head, and then we sell like the retail butterhead, for example. If your greenhouse, like I'm selling more like retail butterhead right now than bowls. But if I were to sell more bowls, we kind of have a minimum spec for bowl weight.
Where size.
Yeah, so like, okay, then like I don't need to hit super high head weights because I'm just trying to hit a certain head weight, and then that will increase sales for our business. If I was doing more retail and I just wanted the biomass, I might try to like change my growing technique to maybe leave it on the line a little bit longer so it can add that biomass and decrease the group sizes. So we do that, we have a lot of meetings and stuff with all my colleagues. We all talk about it all the time because that's kind of what we're being measured on, is what's our yield per group constantly. So we're always trying to push the envelope, but also maintain consistency. And then there's also the nursery space. So we're trying to manage the nursery space to the production space, and just try to manage what the best techniques are, because you can look at it kind of from a data analysis standpoint, but there's a lot of tangible things too that are, you have to just know. So it's kind of the combination between like data science and operational, just like subjective experience. Because you can just run everything through a regression and say like, oh, I just need this, this, and this. But then if you have calcium deficiency, you have tip burn on your crop, and your labor costs go up, and everyone's mad at you, it's not really helpful. So you have to kind of understand people and plants and who you're trying to make happy. So I think it's fun though, because for the nursery, for example, you don't want to keep the plants in there too long because then they're too big and floppy. Then your transplanters are breaking leaves off because it's taking them too long to work with. So you maybe got a little bit more weight, but at the cost of your efficiency of the whole operation. So there's that. And then to answer your question about the, what was the second question was about?
Well, the other knobs you can play with are how much light, the 24-hour window, if you use supplemental lighting, is 13 hours of light going to get more yield than 12, but you're paying for electricity?
Yeah, so
Is there a limit there?
Light has the most, light is the most important thing. It drives everything for us. Temperature is very second, close second. So I try to push the crop as much as possible to the point where we get like tip burn usually. So for lettuce, it's tip burn is our kind of limiting factor. You start to see that calcium deficiency because you're not getting enough boundary layer. You're not breaking the boundary layer to promote transpiration and mass flow of calcium to the growing tip. For us, or for me, that's usually my limiting factor. If I get too much tip burn, then I stop, I turn it down. So I manage the light to that tip burn threshold. And that's usually what that metric is. You can squeeze more growth out by using supplemental lighting. So right now I have we have high pressure sodiums and LEDs. Our new greenhouses are just LEDs. I think that part's really interesting too, because I think like Utah, Bruce Bugby, like I think he's doing some research there, and there's a lot of, UC Davis obviously, there's a lot of research being done now on spectrums. So I think they kind of give you like, usually they just give you an off the shelf. You can have a lot of options, but it's interesting to see the research they're doing with that. I think there's gonna be a lot of room for growth there, because I see it in the greenhouse. I'm like, yeah, if I could change maybe the spectrum, but yeah, I think in terms of, there's a lot of moving pieces. It's kind of like this, you're steering a ship. You can sometimes push the yield, but if it's not consistent, it doesn't help anybody. Because if I have a little bumper crop for a week or two and then they have to discount it because they can't sell it, it's also a problem. So I try to maintain consistency, but also push the envelope at the same time. I think there's a lot of room for growth though with that, that we don't fully understand. Because I think, yeah, it depends on your price of electricity. What's your dollar per kilowatt hour? And yeah, if you increase lights, you will increase yields up to butting up against tip burn. So then you have kind of this yield curve where, yeah, it's almost logarithmic at first, but then it's a shelf where like if you have tip burn on everything, you're not selling them. So the growers like me have to know that stuff, otherwise you can screw things up. And I'll screw things up anyways, but try not to too much. So, yeah.
For outbreaks, is that something that the hydroponic guys have to deal with? Because I know the outdoor lettuce guys, every year, there's always something that pops. I think, was it Taylor and McDonald this year?
Yeah, they had I don't know if it was it Listeria?
It might have been Salmonella.
I think that.
Was it E. coli?
E. coli.
E. coli, that's what it was. But is that an advantage for the hydroponic space and just sort of an overall resiliency that you guys have that the rest of the market, the lettuce market, doesn't have? I know the floods in Monterey really hurt the farmers over there, and then there's just all in freezes, frost. You guys don't have that.
We don't. Sometimes I wish we did, because then you can make excuses. Yeah, and the E. coli thing is big. I know Bright Farms did have an E. coli outbreak, and I'm not trying to throw shade at them, another competitor, but it's mainly like, I think that usually the only cause of it is from employees, which you don't always have complete control over, but you don't have the same things when you have cattle, and hopefully you don't have birds coming in the greenhouse that much. You don't have the same kind of like animals and exposure to that. I know the EPA did like change the regulations, but we're still getting these outbreaks, because I was in Arizona in 2019 when we had the E. coli outbreak, and they're throwing away all the lettuce from all romaine from everywhere. So yeah, you're not protected. But that was, I think it was after a windstorm, and then all that manure got into the canal or something, and it got everywhere. At least that's what I remember. I thought they expanded, the EPA came in and expanded some of those regulations. Long story short, yeah, we suffer less of those issues. We're still privy to whatever's coming through the greenhouse. So like people like to call it controlled environment. I like to say we're kind of like in an altered environment, because you're very much, if the sun's out, your greenhouse is warming up, you're now having to you're kind of reacting to whatever's outside. You're not really controlling it, unless you spend a lot of money on technology. But yeah, you're kind of in much more control. We have less E. coli outbreaks. We can control frost, so we don't get those. I would say it's more of like decreasing your standard deviation of case production, maybe is one way to look at it. Like if you're, if you're seeing volatility in cases per year based off of all these external factors, we just minimize that. We don't have the E. coli. We still, like, the atmospheric rivers did decrease my yields because it was dark every day. So there was a yield decrease, but it wasn't as much as getting your whole field flooded and, having to spray fungicide and losing your own crop. So, yeah.
I know it's probably, we have had an intense conversation here. And one last question. Have there has been any chance that you had to shut down in days for a day? And what was that reason?
We've had all kinds of minor issues. Pipes burst, you lose irrigation for the whole crop for like a day, stuff like that. We haven't had any major things.
Pest pathogen, no.
Oh yeah, so we have pest and pathogen pressure. We have aphids and thrips. We've had botrytis. We've had powdery mildew, and we've had pythium. I mean, those are the big ones. We try to control with the environment, but that's kind of what I meant about the breeding too. I've seen this multiple times where you have botrytis on one crop, decimating like one crop, and then you have another variety right next to it, untouched. And it's just that crop doesn't, it's not as resilient. So I guess the question is like, okay, well, you don't want to spend a ton of money catering to the weakest link of all your variety selections. You want to be able to grow things that are resilient. So yeah, we've had issues. We try to mitigate them, but we're also kind of, pesticide free, and in the greenhouse too. You don't really have access to the same tools that you have in the field production anyways. And it's also, so it is more challenging. But we have never had yet, knock on wood, had to like actually shut down. I think the biggest one that we've seen across the company is basal downy mildew. I've had it once before and it killed the entire crop, basically. The whole greenhouse, or the entire basil crop. They have really good resistant varieties now. And it's just about managing them. But yeah, I mean, downy mildew is big. We haven't gotten hit with the salinus, I think it's INSP, from the thrips, because we haven't had as much thrips pressure. But there's always something going wrong. I wouldn't say going wrong, but there's always something.
So when you say it kills the crop, you've got continuous production.
Yeah.
You're seeding every day, so you've got 40 days worth of production at some stage from seed and germination to planting out. So when it kills the whole crop, you basically have to start over.
Yeah, as far as it goes back.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in that situation, I'm being somewhat dramatic because I think I had like I think I was seeing if I could get away with growing at the time, and this is going back to the genetics conversation. 2 or 3 years ago, we were using a variety that was resistant, but it was poor quality. And then we were growing the variety we liked because it was prone to disease, but it was much better quality. Now that breeder has gotten a much better basil crop that's resilient and also on par with quality with the one that we use. So we just switched to that variety now, and we don't have the same issues with quality anymore. So, I mean, that little simple thing is a game changer for us as a business. Yeah.
You said that you've got solar panels at the Davis, you're generating electricity when you don't need it because you've got sun in the greenhouse. So are you buying power, are you selling power to PG&E when you're generating on the panels? Because PG&E doesn't give you very much money for that electricity.
Yeah, and I don't know the full contract details because we were like leasing the panels technically from like another company. We didn't just outright buy them. But yeah, you're completely right. Our use is basically inverted with our demand. So like when we don't, we need all the electricity in the wintertime to power the lights, which is our biggest energy user. And then in the summertime, we're just powering pumps, keeping the, the chillers have to work harder to keep the coolers cold in the summertime, but we really are just running coolers, fans, and pumps in the summertime.
Have you looked into getting batteries?
We're gonna get batteries too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
You
we got
can store the power, then you can use it for lights at night.
Yeah, I think so, maybe the day-to-day stuff will have like it dialed in a little bit better, but yeah, that's one downside, so yeah, in winter time, we're gonna need electricity, yeah.
I don't know if this is gonna be the last question or not, but if you got a call from NASA and they wanted to put a greenhouse on Mars, what would you advise them?
I don't know if I'm maybe too skeptical. I wouldn't go. And this is purely a personal opinion. I think that it's challenging enough to grow in a greenhouse that's controlled, where you can run to Home Depot. And you can, I think about that all the time because I've met some of the NASA people at like maybe India or something, and I'm like, you really got to know what you're doing, because I think it's commendable to go for that project. I just think I'm like, on a day-to-day basis, you know, a rock comes through and breaks the window, and then we kind of, it's Friday, so no one wants to fix it. You know, there's all that kinds of weird stuff that happens that I'm like, if you're going to Mars, you really have to have a tight ship, because all kinds of things can go wrong. I think it's commendable, and I think it's a very interesting project to try to go for that. And I know, I can't remember the guy's name, but he was working on that, like those little systems. I think it's really interesting because if nothing else, maybe some of the learnings that they're gathering we can use for us, which I think was some of the conversations they were having.
So you could do it on Mars if you took a whole Home Depot.
Yeah.
For your spares and supplies.
I will say, like, if I'd rather put the greenhouse in Hawaii first and figure things out there than go to Mars. But
Well, it's been fascinating. I really appreciate the insights you're sharing. I had no idea. It's like flying an airplane where you're continuously seeding, harvesting, producing and harvesting every day. And you know, it's not like you can stop at any point and take a deep breath and then start up again. You're constantly producing this continuous flow.
Yeah.
Which I hadn't really appreciated before. This has been a very good discussion. We'll break for now if someone needs to leave, whatever, but we'll also be around to answer any questions. And, again, Nick, thanks for
yeah, thanks everybody for coming out and listening.